Well, Rebecca, Patrick, thank you so much for being a guest on this podcast. I absolutely loved your book, Five Generations at Work, How We Win Together for Good. I guess my first question would be, there's a lot of discussion recently. Are generational differences real, or is it merely a kind of marketing hype or a kind of academic fiction? So how real are generational differences?
Well, first of all, again, thank you, Dirk, so much for hosting us. Delighted to be on your pod. I think it's an important point to start with for many reasons, and I think let's begin with Aristotle, perhaps, because Aristotle, I'm sure, would be smiling, if not laughing now, to think that all these centuries on, we are still having this conversation about, the change and the cycle in generations. Because to your point, the change in generations, and again, as one of the great Spanish philosophers that we quote in the book has said, generations simply are one of the wheels through which history turns. So I think that's an important point to set in the wider context of things. The second point is what has changed. So why has this really sort of peaked over the past years, over recent years, something that Patrick and I started to notice and have a close eye on in parallel with the research that we started to undertake across 4 continents. And that is this really overhyped and stereotyped discourse that has emerged in the media. And as we know, that is driven largely by some of the media and by marketing. Obviously, so many organizations are ever in pursuit of the next generation as their next consumer. But of course, going back to that point about context, context is all. Because suddenly what we've arrived in is this sort of melting pot, if you will, of media and marketing seeking to pit generations against each other. And I would say they're not overtly necessarily setting out to do that. We know what happens when you get into these hype cycles of divisive discourses and narrative and indeed narratives. I think one of the things that Patrick and I often talk about is purpose-driven careers is one thing that you'll see on countless publications, which argues that really Gen Z rising up into the workforce and still rising, they would lead you to believe largely that the only generation seeking purpose-driven careers are Gen Z, as we know. That
Yeah,
is
yeah,
absolutely not the case. I'm
yeah,
sure the
yeah.
three of us
We only wanted money. Yeah,
Indeed, the
yeah,
three of us on this pod today,
yeah.
of course, and the rest is true. But I think, and as I before I hand over to Patrick on this, because I think it's an important point to say as well that the context through which generations grow up and how we are formed, the force factors that are upon us are absolutely crucial to this conversation. And just two things to say there. One, which is, we're here in 2025. Patrick and I set out on a journey a few years ago over the course of getting the research done and writing this book. But this confluence of force factors that we're in terms of geopolitics, climate, technology, we are at an inflection point, and we are at an inflection point where you have these force factors converging on the one hand, and of course the ramifications for business and society. And at the same time, we have the simple fact, and this is hard truths across the world, that populations are shape shifting. So, we are living for longer. We shall and may want and need to work for longer. And again, so the implications for all business leaders around how that starts to manifest for their employees and their consumers is a very real one. But also, as Patrick and I take the view, but it's also evidenced in the research, we see this as a huge opportunity for the long-term relevance of their organizations.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's right. And also, Derek, I guess you got to think about, well, what is a generation? Because people think of them as different things. So for our part, I mean, the historical kind of understanding of what a generation was a group of people who come to adulthood about the same time.
Yeah.
And those were broken down into sort of 15, 20, not a
Yeah,
definite sort
yeah.
of.
It was all date driven. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah,
and so whereas what we understand and through looking at this in more detail, it is actually a group of people maybe coming to adult at the same time, but the context in which they do that is it can be very different. The place, the socioeconomic environment, the cultural environment, the technological environment, whether they're in conflict or not. And of course, across the world, people call these generations very different things. So in the West and the North, you have the boomers, Gen X, millennials, Gen Z, all those sort of names. But in other places, you have some quite different names, Born Free in South Africa or 41 in China and so on. I think on this point of the real and the unreal, I mean, really just to reinforce Rebecca's point, I think there are real differences in the way that people see the world because of those factors that we've just talked about. There is a sort of, marketing sort of bit to it, and there's a media bit to it. And I think it's been accentuated by social media and also the sort of abuse of difference, as I would call
Yeah,
it.
yeah,
People want to emphasize difference for their own particular purposes, and that might not be economic. It might be all sorts of other things too. I mean, there are differences in the way we see the
yeah.
world in different generations, and that is a fantastic thing. But as Rebecca says, we need to maximize the opportunity
Yeah.
rather than maximize the difference.
Yeah. And can you mention, Patrick, picking up on that point, can you mention some of, let's say, the friction points and stereotypes that generations have regarding each other?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose if you look at the root cause of them,
Hmm.
they're generally because we don't understand each other. Why is that person saying that? Why is that person behaving that way? Why are they feeling that? And then there's, the communication. We don't quite understand the language. It's not necessarily just the meaning, but it's also sometimes the method of communication, just sometimes the words or the way it's communicated. And I think that inability to listen to what people think and just maybe take literally what they say also gets in the way. So you have, these feelings that, our generation's never had it.
Hmm.
We're the worst treated generation. And, certainly as a young person growing up in inner city Liverpool,
Yeah.
you could easily feel that then, and you could easily feel that now. Perhaps some of the challenges people face aren't quite as significant, but they have different challenges, and to
Yeah.
them, they are as significant. So I think I'm not a fan of sort of picking on a particular thing. I think it's important to think about, why do people feel that way? Why do
Yeah.
they think that? Why do they say that? What do they actually mean
Yeah.
by that? I mean, instantly, my grandmother is an uneducated Irish woman, fantastically clever. She said, it's really important to listen to what people say, but even more important to listen to what they think.
Yeah.
Um, and I don't think we put enough effort into thinking what people might be thinking.
Nee,
Uh,
nee, nee. I think you're absolutely right, and I think it might also be a matter of respect to a certain extent, because
Absolutely,
as let's
absolutely.
say a proud baby boomer, I'm father to I think millennials and Gen Zers, and of course they see our generation as kind of look at what you did for the environment, look at what you did for basically wealth distribution in the world, etc. And then from my point apart, he said, yeah, but we will the welfare state, and if it weren't up to us, that. So is there also, let's say, a question of respect, especially with the elder generations, or is this a Dirk problem?
I don't know whether it's a Dirk problem, but I suspect it goes both ways. Would be my feeling. I'm similar to you. I'm guessing. Rebecca's obviously much younger, but the just that sort of different people bringing different things.
Yeah.
I find when we get together as a family or or a group of friends with different generations there, it's fantastic when you hear these different thoughts, different ideas, different perspectives in the workplace, which obviously is where the book is focused. You're seeing that through innovation because of difference. I mean, people talk about conflict and difference as a negative thing, but it can be the spark to tremendous creativity. It can be the spark to deep sort of respect for people when you think, actually, why did I think that? I find that often with my three boys that they make you think and think, what the hell have I been doing?
Yeah.
Why did I do that? They seem to have a much more sensible approach on this particular issue, and then you have the same feeling the other way, and they say, "Oh God, Dad, yeah, I didn't really know that. I didn't really realize that. That's why." And I think those are magic moments, really, to savor.
Yeah, yeah, because I think that point that you're making, Patrick, brings me to a point which I really liked in your book is that you say, well, we should turn generational labels into lenses. And could you perhaps elaborate on the meaning behind this metaphor and how it could shift our perspective on intergenerational dynamics?
Rebecca, you should go on this one.
Thank you. And thanks, Dirk. I think I'm really glad you picked up on this because I think the times that Patrick and I have conversations around this very point, and to Patrick's point just now, in terms of sometimes, that one observation, there are a lot of people actually who've reached us on the basis of, oh, tell us more. You're absolutely right. We need to start looking through lenses rather than labels. And, one of the many leaders and people that we draw on in the body of work behind the book is the CEO of Channel 4, and they have done a lot of work, mainly actually on one generation, which is Gen Z, and importantly, again, it is done in this context of lenses versus labels. But she talks about, and I quote, we're living in an age of overclassification. I'm not sure it's helping any of us.
I love that quote. I absolutely love that quote. Yeah.
And I think that reinforces, to your point, some of a little bit of the mess that, the world has got itself into for all intents and purposes when we started out with the conversation around silos and stereotypes and this divisive discourse. Because with that being so prevalent, and again, couple that with partial attention spans and just the sheer proliferation of content that is coming at us every day, the ability to cut through this overclassification, coupled with what I see with a lot of work companies that I work with also. I think the sense of, where does one even begin, when there's also, and you touch on this later on, I think we'll come back to this, and you talk about DEI projects and initiatives. I think, again, that's also part of the problem because, so many organizations out of good intent, are frankly also mired in doing too much now. And again, the ability to cut through that. But I think what this gets to the heart of when we look at labels and lenses is really two of the big things that we saw and it was consistent. It was inconsistent, Dirk, in the 4 continents that we traveled through to conduct this research, over quite a series of time. And again, we pulsed that research as well because it was really important, to Patrick's point, to look at, okay, well, if this is what some of media and marketing is constantly pumping into the world and telling people and reinforcing, and we also know that actually a lot of that is in a very, I'm being kind here, a very cheeky headline that, is clickbait led and polarizing, and people aren't reading beyond that. It's seeping into the psyche. And we really wanted to get into that gap around, what are people saying and what are people thinking? And that's where, the AI powered research, I will say also that none of the book is written by AI. Patrick and I are far too purist in our writing approach. But it really got to the heart of 2 things, Dirk, which is one, both the problem and the opportunity, which is how well do we understand each other? This ability, two big buckets really that came through that research was understanding and communication. And Patrick touched on some of that in the previous question, but understanding and communication just fundamental across the board, whether it's large corporates, family businesses, world of social purpose and beyond. So when we look at understanding, the sense of that's where we get to looking at through lenses rather than labels, because first of all, when we think about leadership teams, how are they currently looking at the demographics of their organization? If we are, which we are, living through this inflection point, the most generationally diverse demographic in history, how do you look at your performance metrics? What is the mapping that you're currently doing of your organization? So that's one big one in terms of how leadership teams, are looking. Are you looking again through labels of the past, or actually again these stereotype labels versus or segmentation that is no longer relevant, rather than matching that through to the evolving demographics? Second big point around understanding, and this is where Patrick and I get really excited, is also with that knowledge, first of all, by the way, that starts to open up a huge treasure trove of how you're able to really map what's going on. Again, that gap between, we talk a lot about the say-do gap. I think there's also the think-say gap that we can perhaps introduce as one to close. But the really exciting is the engine room of, what is the understanding happening intergenerationally? Because you've got these 5 generations at work. You've got increasingly clients who are commanding and demanding a brain trust of people, as Patrick was just alluding to, within a family context, different perspectives, working on your brief, your project, whatever that endeavor might be. You're bringing all together inherently more diverse thinking, a melting pot, hopefully, of creativity and innovation. Of course, that doesn't come without difference. And again, difference is good and it's a strong thing. I think also that ties into our inability sometimes. And again, this is where the media has been so wrong in so many ways to keep, we are living through polarized and fractured and fragmenting times, Dirk. We won't get into that because, Patrick and I are very much pragmatic optimists. But that's not to say that shadow of context, we're all living with that wherever we are in the world today. Question is, though, what agency, we're not running countries, we're not running, governments, but in whether we are starting out on our career, a middle manager, a CEO of a FTSE 100, we all have agency in some respect. And so our bid is that when we know that understanding and communication are two of the big force factors within, in terms of turning what might be, let's say, an organization that is falling into the traps and tropes of this siloed and stereotyped discourse versus an organization that is really seeking to answer the question that is keeping probably most CEOs up at night, which, as we know from report after report, is will my business be relevant and will it still be here in the next decade? And that's, again, there's countless evidence again that we've unpacked in the book to show that if you're investing more intergenerationally, because again there's a huge distinction between a multi-generational workforce and what you do with it, how do you make it more intergenerational? That's again what we get excited about, because there are so many organizations who have gone beyond, Dirk, seeing this as a problem. And to Patrick's point, yes, in conflict, there is truth and reality, but also turn that conflict into opportunity. And the same applies for some of the organizations that we were lucky enough to discover along the way and share some of their work.
Yeah, because it brings me to a next question, which I found really interesting in the book, because there were two data points. The first data point that struck my attention was that Deloitte reported that there's only 6% of the organizations that believe that their leaders effectively manage the generational differences that you identified, Rebecca. But simultaneously, the World Economic Forum identifies generational differences as a substantial source of competitive advantage. How can companies strategically leverage these different perspectives and skills of a multi-generational workforce to gain that competitive advantage? So how can they basically leverage and use that opportunity?
Yeah, and I think in the book you'll see there's different ways that people are doing it that are very legitimate and sometimes context specific, but there are some general patterns. So one big thing we discovered over 200 next-gen boards. And next-gen boards are growing rapidly as a means of connecting the generations. People would historically talk when next-gen boards first started to be created, it's giving that generation a voice or giving that group a voice. Actually, we've moved well beyond that. If we look at the next-gen boards that Rebecca and I have been involved in, for example, the EY Foundation, that had a next-gen board from the very start, from startup 10 years ago, or nearly 11 years ago. And that was really not just to have those different perspectives, but also to have them involved in the decisions, to have them involved in thinking through, well, what will be the communication strategy that will be the right one to do that. So it was the design of the programs, the whole thing. And those next-gen board members were also, some of them were on the board committees as well as the main board, and that added huge value too. So next-gen boards is a big one, and we talk in the book a lot about, well, if you think in a second about what things you need to think about and so on. Then there are really innovative programs that companies have come up with. Rebecca can probably talk about the LVMH one, Mars, the EU itself has some amazing programs. For lots of different generations. Some of them are focused on a particular generation. Some of them are focused on combining generations. So there's just, in fact, we had a great challenge in the book. More the challenge was more what to leave out, and that there are literally hundreds well, we probably had thousands in the end of examples, and we used AI interestingly to, you know, scan the world and see what things were being done, and we found a sort of treasure trove of examples. But maybe the LVMH one is a good one,
Yeah.
Rebecca, to just briefly touch on.
Yeah, it's a great point, Patrick. And again, to Patrick's point, I think, what is so edifying about, of course, we went into this with the hypothesis, Dirk, because obviously there was a body of work that Patrick and I were working on, through our own work, both independently, together, and a whole host of things that we were also seeing through the course of the many strands to what we do. So we went into this with a pragmatically optimistic hypothesis, but of course, what was so edifying, especially through the AI illumination that came through, was there is no single solution. There are many, and that is a powerful message. I think again, this is not about size of business, scale of business, what sector you're in. There is so much that is transferable. LVMH is an organization that I've worked with over the years, and as we know, the leading global powerhouse in luxury goods. It operates across a portfolio of over 75 individual brands. Some of those are literally the most valuable brands in the world. And of course, when you think about that structure, it's a structure of highly articulated verticals. Again, they can, for so many listening into this pod, that mirrors up to 75 business units, departments, categories, however we might want to look at that. And of course, as with many leading businesses, they are highly articulated verticals in which, the flow of knowledge, the level of expertise is absolutely par excellence, both literally and metaphorically, because it's LVMH. And of course, what was exciting was, I think, two things for us, because obviously I knew LVMH quite well over the years. I think what is so inspiring, because from the outside in, a lot of people would argue, oh, well, this is a huge company, Rebecca. They have the resources and the investment to do all these powerful things. Well, the example that we showcase in the book, which is called LVMH Dare, which stands for Disrupt and Act and Risk to be an Entrepreneur, is a platform that operates horizontally across all these 75 plus verticals. And I think why it was so inspiring, as you know, which was it was inspired by one employee, and one employee who said, look, I'm looking for my next move. It might be, outside the business, and actually I'd quite like to stay. I like working here, but I simply don't know enough about what's going on. And again, Patrick and I, do love a good story of somebody who, instead of solving a problem perhaps just for themselves, they also go on to solve it for hundreds of other people. And that's what this individual did. And again, what it's doing, and I think that's what Patrick and I love so much, and that's where, to Patrick's point about what we left out of the book, right? Because there is so much here that we want to showcase that others can replicate and others can learn from. And the final point to that is, these are not hero models of work. They're not hero models of leadership, Dirk, because I think what we were very keen to evidence was this is working in the everyday, because that is where, and again, we quote the brilliant Ken Frazier, who talks about leadership is in the many small, quiet moments with the team. And this is really about, less of these hero models of leadership that have been taught on some of the MBAs over the years. But, perhaps they've had a place and time. But, in the context of the times that we're in, and in this more generationally diverse demographic, I think we need different models of, what we learn from, how we learn. And, this platform of what became an open platform for collaboration and innovation, hardwired to the business strategy for LVMH. It's not theoretical. These are not false problems. It's very real. They're building this everyday muscle of collaboration. And to Patrick's point, again, this is not a single generation. This example, this was opened up to the entire organization. I think finally, another reason why it's just so interesting for people just to read it and just to absorb and to think about what might I learn and adopt in my business is that it wasn't remotely set up as we have a generations problem here. It came from a problem over here. It happened, therefore, to include all generations across the organization very effectively. So that goes back to your original question of looking through lenses rather than labels, and that gets us further, and it gets us further together.
And that had 30,000 people involved in it. And coming up with all sorts of interesting business innovations, solving problems, but also creating new businesses.
Because one of the things is in your book, and I was reading example after example, and Now, I spent almost my entire career working in publicly traded companies. And I got really jealous if I read about, let's say, the amount of initiatives and the innovative thinking going on in family businesses. And it's interesting. Yesterday, I interviewed Sander Tiedemann, who's an expert on corporate social responsibility, and he had the same thing. There are so many examples, let's say, of family companies who seem to be way ahead in terms of best practices of managing some of the complex challenges in our society, and they have already done that for a longer time. So, I guess that brings me to my next question. Family-owned businesses constitute of about 70% of the global economy. You highlight in the book, amongst others, their long-term perspective, holistic stakeholder perspective, the mutual loyalty between these companies and their employees. Do you believe that public companies who operate in a shareholder value context could realistically adopt all or some of these practices? And if so, how could they do that?
I think the first point, Dirk, is that with that there's quite a lot of variability within publicly traded
Yeah.
companies and quite a lot of variability within family companies. So we have highlighted examples where we think, because we're focused on what are the solutions, what are maximizing opportunity things. But there are many family companies that don't follow these things, and they tend not to survive. And there are many public companies that have been around for a very long time, doing some great stuff. And so I think again, it's a bit like the label lenses thing. I think family companies have some inherent advantages to be able to think more positively intergenerationally. And so if you look in Switzerland where you are today, if you look at Hoffmann-La Roche and
Yeah.
you look at some of those amazing Swiss businesses that are just globally very significant in what they've done. Amazing. You look in Finland, you look at Alstrom, or you look at Lego, or you look at there's lots of these businesses that exist, and they firstly it's because the pressure to think short term is just not the same.
Yeah.
So I know from my background being in a FTSE 100 3i, we were a long-term investor, but we still had quarterly results. So you have to deliver sort of quarter by quarter, and you've got to be pretty resilient, pretty robust to do things which will be of benefit in 10 or 20 years time, when you might have analysts score
Yeah.
or hedge fund investors doing what they do. So
Yeah,
there are some
according to
inevitable.
our calculations, this should be your revenue and your profit and hence share price at this moment in time,
Yeah.
and explain the difference. Yeah.
Yeah. On the other hand, finding successors, you've got to have an amazing gene pool to produce a
Yeah.
stream of
Yeah.
women and men who will be capable of taking it to the next stage. So therefore, you have models in some of these family companies where the ownership is family, but the management is not so much family these days. They've hired in, professional managers, and they come up with a governance model,
Yeah.
which means the family still can hold true to the things that it believes. So if you look at Bosch in Germany, would be a good example. You look at Hoffmann-La Roche, we talked about earlier. Where you have very little family involved in the management, but they do have that ownership
Yeah.
kind of control's not always the nicest of words, but they have
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
degree of control through
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
that they can ensure that it adheres to the values and do the right things. And Mars is an amazing example of that. So
Yeah.
Mars, I think, is for me was one of the most interesting cases in the book because it wasn't that they'd suddenly discovered intergenerations and other forms of difference. Way back, I think in 1947, there's a letter from the then leader of the business basically saying, these are the principles by which we want to run this company. and the one that really is standout, I think, which is not wasn't an obvious thing at the time, and isn't obvious for many people now, is mutuality. So, our business depends on so many other different people. And it was almost like, I mean, I spent a lot of time in Africa, and it was almost like the African principle of Ubuntu.
Yeah.
We exist because of other people,
Yeah.
and other people exist. We contribute to them as well. And it was a real kind of, I mean, an amazing
Yeah.
thing. And what's interesting is when you talk to people now, members of the family, the Mars family, or members of staff, they all still talk about mutuality.
Yeah. Yeah.
It'll soon be 100 years on.
Uh,
It's quite something.
no, but it's amazing what you say, because I once in my career had the pleasure to work as a management consultant for a family firm for a long time, and they were in the shipbuilding industry.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing in the shipbuilding industry is, just like you said, it was almost a kind of ecosystem where everyone
Yeah.
realized that everyone needed to survive
Yeah.
for the long
Yeah.
term, because simply there weren't that many around. So you
Yeah.
could basically, put it in a nasty way, you could basically undermine each other for one deal. But basically, if one of you got out of business, the whole system had a problem. So
Exactly.
that was an
Yeah.
interesting observation.
Yeah.
There's also one thing in the book, and I think, Rebecca, that must be primarily in your alley. And I thought it was a fascinating quote. It was a compelling quote from Charlie Rubin of Pentland Capital, and I'll quote:
Yeah.
"Brand relevance is about how we connect across generations." That really sounds fascinating. So given your experience in business and branding, could you perhaps unpack the meaning of this statement and the implications for companies seeking to remain relevant in a multi-generational marketplace? Because I think it's a beautiful quote, and it's really underlines the importance of a brand. So could you expand on that one?
It's such a beautiful quote, isn't it? And I think that's an all credit to Charlie and the Pentland, and the Rubin family at Pentland, because I think that's one of the huge values in the approach we took also to the case studies, that they are all conversations, they're all in dialogue, and that was also very intentional, really, to bring to life. We weren't always talking with 5 generations of a business, or indeed 5 generations of consumers, but that's really what Charlie is getting to the heart at. Is what Charlie is getting to the heart of. So Pentland Group, for everyone on the pod, I'm sure many will know, is a portfolio of brands in broadly the lifestyle and sports sectors. And of course, we have 5 generations of employees and 5 generations of customers and consumers and other stakeholders. And Charlie and the whole of the family actually spoke very powerfully about something that is very intrinsic to what they do, and also very intentional in terms of how they do it, Dirk, in the sense of how they're seeking to constantly better connect the employee experience to consumer experience. And of course, when we think about your talent pipeline, how you attract, motivate, mobilize, and retain talent is on every organization's mind. Going back to your previous point about, what the world of, let's say the big FTSEs and the big corporations and shareholder led organizations can learn from family business, and indeed from vice versa. This is about leading organizations regardless of that context. But I think what's very true of all these organizations, we've seen a big drop in engagement scores in many cases. We track that through COVID, in fact, again through that body of research that we did, but we see it rife in a lot of the reports, big workplace and workforce reports coming out. And, again, seeking to be very proactive and preemptive in not even closing that gap. I think, again, it goes back to that point of Pentland is a group that, is not seeking to problem solve. They're looking to, again, address this as a maximizing opportunity, going back to that maximizing mindset. So within that portfolio, for example, I'll give a couple of cases in point. They have brands that skew to sometimes different generations. So a very young portfolio, which is more targeted to the kids market. And in that case, what they seek to do is think very intentionally about. We are very fortuitous as a family-owned business that we have quite a diverse portfolio of brands. So they are intentional in terms of career mobility, and matching perhaps younger generations, into younger generations of SKUs of certain brands in that portfolio. But for the majority of those brands, the same principle is true of this brand relevance across generations, is that they're constantly going through cycles of relevance, as whether boomers, Gen Xers, or even millennials, there are brands that, many generations have already grown up with, that have been loved and, still loved. They need constantly, and also to your point earlier, for those brands to continue to go through a constant reinvention. So Berghaus is one, again, which straddles, sort of two generations. There are others which are, sort of going through that next cycle. So how you maintain, how you are restless in your pursuit of relevance of your brand to often multiple generations. And when you think about it, sort of perhaps parents and children at the same time in those different aspects. So they're very clever in terms of how they, and again, it's none of this is overtly, again, that's where Charlie is just so arch, it's such a beautiful quote, because it's not rocket science per se, but I think how many organizations are as deeply intentional, in making that statement and constantly thinking about how they do it. And, I'll give you an example from, we talked about LVMH earlier on, and going back to the family business point, Hermes is another really good example of what we think about brand relevance, how we connect across generations. One of the reasons I've loved working with a lot of these, I call them excellence brands, is because these are brands in the luxury industry who have, and we think about the Swiss watch industry alone, which owns,
case in point,
there you go, it's 200 years strong, 300 years strong. So these are brands that have lived through and held relevance generations before us. And so, this is a really interesting moment for those leaders of these brands today, thinking about, well, I'm not just thinking about the next, generation. I'm thinking, how will this brand be living in the next 200, 300 years, which is really exciting. And that's why, a brand like Hermes is fascinating, because consistently that is a brand that has always been known. It's why I teach it as one of the case studies that I teach on at universities, which is the case study, which is a true masterclass in a culture of excellence, because they think in generations and they think in decades, and that is hardwired to their strategy. They say no far many more times than they say yes. Their collaborations are fewer and further between. But again, as you start to look at that in terms of brand value growth over time, the business value, how you look at, employee stickiness, how you look at, all these other angles of measurement, it's really exciting, because what they're doing is protecting the brand for the longer term. So that, that's taking down, that ego and the id of going back to your point. This is where I love your line of questioning, Dirk, because all of these things are so inextricably linked. What we also see in many organizations is, maybe I ask the question a lot, how constrained are we by the metrics of the past? Because of course, we have more data at our fingertips than ever, but what are we measuring? Why are we measuring it? Is it still relevant to what we need to be looking at in our organization? Because again, it goes back to that point around lenses rather than labels. Really, what are we doing? Why are we doing it? All this comes back to the business strategy. So when leadership sometimes sort of challenges, and I've heard this from chief people officers, I've heard this from chief HR officers many times, is that, they get challenged sometimes by their CEO to say, well, surely this is another, the generational conversation is another project and initiative. And as Patrick and I have evidenced, and we knew it from the start, it's far from that. Actually, if you don't have a generational strategy, or rather, if you have a generational strategy, so much of everything else starts to fall away, because age is the one dimension of diversity that we all share. And as we said, if populations are shape-shifting, we are living for longer, this has to be hardwired to the business strategy. And and there are exciting things that can come. As Charlie says, brand relevance is about how we connect across generations.
I think that's a beautiful story, and I never realized that, but now I see the difference between the challenges for for brands that I consider to be as hip and cutting edge. Basically, my children associate with people of my my generation. But if I pick up on one of the things that you said about age, I think many discussions around diversity, equity, and inclusion focus on ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation. But in your view, should age and, for instance, the potential for ageism be explicitly included as a dimension as well? And the reason for my question is that I think at this moment the Western world seems to struggle with a problem, which is on the one hand that life expectancy in terms of its effect on pensions and demographics basically need, let's say, older people to work longer. And on the other hand, the enthusiasm of a lot of companies to hire people beyond their 50s seems to be extremely limited. So isn't there a
Yeah.
discrepancy, and how should that be addressed?
Yeah, there's a huge tension. I mean, what's interesting, I think it's on page 27 of the book. There's a one page
Yeah,
with globally the demographic
yeah,
population pyramids. And you see in the Americas, so that's North and South, you see in Europe, you see in Asia, these kind of inverted triangle
yeah,
shapes
exactly.
starting to appear.
Yeah,
In Africa, however, you see completely the opposite. It's almost like an equilateral triangle at the moment. You have some countries where
yeah,
you have, getting on for half the population under 18. I mean, amazing
yeah,
things. There will be a billion more Africans. The place where this issue that you're describing plays out most prominently at the moment is in the US, particularly. And it's interesting, when we did the Washington launch of the book, a lot of the people that came were representatives from lobby groups for older people. And what they were describing was, you have this situation where many leaders have been hollowing out the over 50s. However, in the US, where pension provision is, surprisingly poor,
yeah,
given the wealth
yeah.
of the nation, where health costs are
Sky
staggeringly
high.
high,
Yeah,
you have many people who thought that they would be absolutely fine by now,
yeah,
but they need to work probably
yeah,
well into their 70s, some 80s, just to live not an extravagant lifestyle, but just to sort of survive. Or they're going to have to be supported by their children and younger family members. So historically, it's been the older generations of supporting the younger generations financially. But what you're finding now is this is starting to invert. And you have in some cultures also, you have, because of that hollowing out, the over 50s, particularly in physical craft type roles, jobs. You've got companies struggling because they can't get the people who can do certain sorts of things. And one interesting example in the book was BMW, where they're bringing back,
yeah,
have been bringing back retired engineers, not to train younger engineers in the technical bit, but more about how to think like an engineer, how to problem solve. If you look in Japan, some of the amazing things that have been government funded and funded in other ways to preserve, a lot of really high end crafts, things that actually are more difficult to do through AI, through robotics, those sort of things. So I think there's a tension there. I think there will be social tension, and you're seeing that play in the UK at the moment, where there's deep tensions around the affordability of housing, around the social, the care
yeah,
provision. And you're seeing this not just in the UK or the US, you're seeing this,
yeah,
across the world in many different places. In Korea, where you have, I think the birth rate now
yeah.
is only
Yeah,
0.74
correct.
and
Yeah,
falling. These are dramatic things. And from a GDP, if that is your God, I'm not sure it should be a God, but it is for many people. GDP, demographic growth and GDP, there's a strong linkage there. I personally think in Africa that equilateral triangle, I think that projection of the billion people might come down a bit as economies in many places are growing more rapidly. The birth rate falls. But obviously, what you've also had in Africa is the life expectancy has
yeah,
been increasing significantly, with the
yeah. Better
Paris
healthcare, and yeah,
and
yeah,
other
yeah,
things. Yeah. So I think it's a fascinating point, fascinating inflection point. But I think though that looking at that page, those statistics just makes you think of many things really. You know, and in terms of the opportunity side, do companies have a good Africa strategy?
Yeah.
Many have no Africa strategy.
No. No.
So, you know, I've had a few people say to me, "Wow, that's made me think we really need to get our act together. What are we going to do
Yeah.
in Africa?" So, and that's great. That's looking at the opportunity.
And I think that's a good point. It's a kind of the same question companies need to ask themselves 15, 20 years ago about India, which developed as a kind
Yeah.
of, kind of powerhouse of let's say, intellectual capacity. And well, but one of the things you just mentioned, BMW, it struck me in the book, there were a lot of examples of, let's say, older generations looking to tap the wisdom and the insights from younger generation. There is the example of BMW bringing older employees back to the workplace. Are there more examples of, let's say, younger generations reaching out to elder generations to gain their insights, or is it, let's say, largely a kind of one direction type of initiative or reaching out? What are your perspectives on that?
It's a brilliant question, Dirk. Many answers to that. But I think, again, one of these things goes back to, is your organization a one-way street, or again, going back to that point of mutuality, because you see a number of things happening for those organizations who are starting to get engaged in this maybe for the first time. They see it as maybe it's I need to have a Gen Z strategy. It's all about the young generation rising through. And I've heard that with a number of leadership teams I've talked with and worked with, and what they want to understand is but tell me all about Gen Z, Rebecca. Actually is, to Patrick's point earlier.
Can you tell us about these incomprehensible creatures that are populating our markets and are now seeping into the workplace?
That's right, exactly. And not least, going back to your point, is that you've got people who are sort of tipping into that, as you say, there's 50, which is this wretched sort of what has become this awful sort of twilight zone, as you say, sort of where you have this expertise that has accumulated over years, the sense of judgment, perspective, and all these amazing things that goes with it, as you say, that written off by recruiters, this now sort of false ceiling that is sort of caving in. And converse to that, again, as we've evidenced in the book, there's a lot of work which Mars is a very good example actually of being very intentional in work that they are doing to say, look, we are investing in the flow of knowledge within our organization, and part of that is looking at recasting roles within the Mars structure so that we're unlocking that knowledge. But I think, again, a lot of this comes back to do you have a mutual strategy, or is this sort of one-way problem solving? And I think, again, the rhetoric hasn't necessarily helped us along the way, because as we know, look at the sheer proliferation of language that has grown up with this, whether we think about, and I'm going back now I'm just stepping back for a moment into the world of workplace sort of jargon, which is, every clickbait headline, loves a new term, loves a new neologism, whether it's, sort of quiet quitting, quit talk, and all these things that have risen up. And that's important because I think within this sheer noise, a number of things have been latched onto them. One of them is reverse mentoring. And it's interesting because, of course, there's been a lot of good that's come through, reverse mentoring that has happened. But implicit within reverse mentoring is a one-way street. Now, I cite reverse mentoring. It's explicitly because in the body of research that we conducted across these 4 continents, mutuality came up time and again. What are people really saying, and what is really resonating? Not only did mutuality come up in the spirit of what people are doing or seeking more of, but people talked very openly about, either mutual mentoring that was working, or just the need for more mutuality in mentoring. It didn't necessarily need to be couched as this, what has become quite, a trend of reverse mentoring. Again, not to say that hasn't had a role, but I think so shifting our mindset towards learning from and with each other, because again, an increasingly more intergenerational workforce, or again, more effective intergenerational workforces, we need the ability, we need need more mutual structures? How are we learning with and from each other on an everyday basis? There's also, I'm a bit of a quote nerd, as Patrick knows, but there's a beautiful quote that I take from Toni Morrison in her Nobel Prize acceptance speech, and it's really powerful. And she talks about, meaning that secures our human difference. And that's really what we're talking about in this book. We're celebrating human difference and celebrating that in all its individuality, and in how it connects to collaborative and collective potential. Again, another quote from Lena Nair. She is one of the very few chief people officers, went from Unilever to run a leading powerhouse again, a brand that has lived across generations in Chanel. And she is talking very explicitly, about the value of more collaborative leadership, which is seeking to empower and enable more collective intelligence in our organizations. And so that's fantastic. Again, what we're seeing is, quite a shift, towards it. So I think that's one big point behind what you say. I think another interesting thing is what we also sought to do in that edit that Patrick alluded to earlier on, which is, the examples that aren't in the book. I guess it's the V&A has just opened their second museum in London, and maybe there's an analogy there. It's probably too grandiose for our endeavours, Patrick, but they've just put the part of their archive, out in another part of London. There's probably the archive of our book, Patrick, that we need to unpack with all the other case studies. But where we were very intentional, Dirk, was in the case studies that we showed up that have showed up in the book, which were very much two-way street. So you could argue that, okay, next generation boards are designed explicitly, to really give rise to, who are we listening to in the organization? But the important thing is the strategic intent of those next generation boards are to say, well, first, look, as we know, we've still got a problem on so many boards across the world. When we look at diversity of perspective, St. Gallen Symposium, as we talked about earlier on, they track the current age tracking that they've done is, it's an average age of 63, which, again, as we're looking at, of course, on the one hand, aging populations, but, we're missing out, at least two generations along the way who are not present around the table. And of course, when we think about that board representation, how is that board mirroring the very 5 generations of consumers that we're serving? So that's what Patrick and I are getting to along the, our championship that we have done over the years around the value of next generation boards, because they shouldn't be seen as, just a platform. And of course, it's a very important one to, bring young talent on and give a platform for rising voices earlier on. But frankly, it's a business imperative. It's a strategic imperative. Who are we listening to, or who are we not listening to? So for us, we cannot emphasize enough the fact that these are platforms of mutuality, and the benefits of the benefits of that mutuality are hardcore business imperatives that are showing up over the long term, as we've evidenced in the book.
And some people are using the next gen board term to think about using that tag in the context of the next generation of the organization, rather than, so they're multi-generational next gen boards, which is really interesting, I think.
And I think, Patrick, that's also one of the interesting things in the book that you and Rebecca wrote is it's not just a focus group.
Absolutely.
Right. It's not just we want to understand them. So basically, let's sit together with them to understand, but it's actively soliciting their input.
And I think, Dirk, I'll just double click on that point very quickly, if I may, because you raise a really important point. Where this goes wrong, and again, we've evidenced, work across the world. We've evidenced the leading examples, but for any CEO leadership team out there who is interested in the next generation board, or interested in this sort of multi-generation approach to that, is it should never be the CEO's secret elite, which runs counter to this. One of the reasons why Gucci, back in its 7-year ascendancy and growth period, was very successful is it was in a period of deeply connecting culture on the inside to the cultural zeitgeist, to where it was really sort of taking off in terms of where CEO and creative director were working together. But the CEO at the time was very vocal and transparent about what that shadow committee, as it was called, a form of next generation board meant. So I think that's one important point. The second point is something that I see almost on a weekly basis, Dirk, which is just the sheer noise in organizations that is holding some organizations back. And by that, I mean, you just talked about it, this project and initiative overload. The academic Megan Wright has talked about this as, organizations that are pathologically busy. Well, if you're pathologically busy, that doesn't necessarily correlate to, how you're looking to long-term growth, the ideation, the innovation that is fueling, really your engine two of the business, or, your longer term relevance. So, that is, I think, an important one. Are we even making the space or time for this to happen? And that's why, setting up a next generation board, frankly, is the obverse to yet another project or initiative. What I argue is that, this is about doing fewer things well and sustaining them.
Rebecca and Patrick, thank you so much for this conversation. I really learned a lot. We've covered a range of topics from your book, Five Generations at Work. I really love the book and highly recommend it, and I'll put it in the show notes of this podcast. Although we covered a wide range of topics, are there any final thoughts or crucial aspects of intergenerational dynamics in the workplace that we haven't yet discussed and that you feel would be important to highlight?
Shall we pick one each, Patrick?
Yeah, go on, Rebecca.
Seems like a good formula. Yeah.
We'll close out with one each then, Dirk. And again, thank you so much again, Dirk, for such a wonderful conversation. It was so rich. I'll take one, which is, we absolutely have to reinforce that this is a maximizing opportunity. As we said, we are living through the most generationally diverse demographic in history, and that is only going to continue to go in one way as we are living for longer and wanting and needing to work for longer. So I think the organizations at the moment, as we mapped in the book, fall into broadly three categories. One, those who are not taking any action at the moment for whatever reason. Largely, a lot of that is lack of awareness, or they're being influenced by the wrong narratives, as you talked about at the beginning. The second group of organizations who are aware but are mainly in problem-solving mode. And the third group, and again, these are the organizations that we have evidenced in the book, but obviously doing a lot of work with, who are acting on it as a maximizing opportunity. So I guess our will and wish is that for that trajectory of travel to keep tipping into bucket three, who are seeing this very much as a maximizing opportunity.
Yeah,
thank you so much.
And I'll go with one word: think. So I think we need to think more about the maximizing opportunity of intergenerational working, and I think we need to listen more to what people think.
No, I think that's a beautiful statement, Patrick. Thank you for finishing with that, and thank the two of you for participating on this podcast. I learned a lot from it, and I really enjoyed our interview. So looking forward to staying in touch.
Great,
Likewise,
thank
Dirk.
you.
Thank you so
Really
much.
good.
Right.